Did you ever wonder where prices come from? Why things cost what they cost in the store? In this video, we're going to be looking at various pricing decisions and how companies decide how much to charge for the stuff they sell. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand the three major influences on pricing decisions. You should understand how companies make short-run pricing decisions, as well as long-run pricing decisions. You should be able to price products using the cost-plus approach, and you should be able to use lifecycle budgeting and costing when making pricing decisions. There are three general pricing strategies that we're going to talk about. The first one is called target pricing, and this is where you price your product based on what you think customers are willing to pay. The second is called cost-plus pricing, and that's where the selling price is determined by looking at the product's cost. How you define cost is another story, but you look at the product's cost plus a markup, and again, this is known as a cost-based price. And then finally, something called life cycle pricing, where you're looking at cradle-to-grave costs. This includes things like environmental costs, reclamation costs, recycling costs, reuse costs, and so on. What are some influences on price? How companies price a product or service ultimately depends on the demand and supply for it. For instance, gas right now is not particularly in need because a lot of people are staying home due to the COVID crisis. So the price of gas has fallen somewhat. In contrast, when things were really popular and everyone was buying gas, the price went up. We're going to look at three influences on demand and supply. The first is competitors, the second is customers, and the last is costs. First of all, let's look at competitors. Their effect on pricing depends on the competitive environment, whether you have monopoly or competition, the pricing schemes that are used, the various product features that they introduce to market, as well as the production volume. So for example, you can get a camera that is fully spec'd right now, and it'll cost you upwards of $6,000. Or you can buy a simple camera that might cost you only a few $100s. Those additional features can really drive up or down the price depending on what's being added and what's left out. Now, if you're in a competitive market, then a company must accept the price that customers are willing to pay. If the market isn't particularly competitive, or if you make something that no one else can make, then you can probably charge a lot more for that particular thing. Customers. Customers influence price demand for a product or service based on quality, availability, and substitutability. Now, if you've taken a strategy course, you've probably learned a little bit about these terms, but generally speaking, the idea here is that if a customer really wants your product or service, you can charge more for it. And if people don't particularly want what it is you're selling, you should probably sell something else, but it will also drive down the price of what it is you're selling. And then finally, costs. Costs influence price because they affect supply. And the lower the cost, the greater the quantity a firm is willing to supply. The price you sell your product for must cover all of your costs in the long run and ultimately produce a profit. Time horizons and pricing. Short-run pricing decisions have a time horizon of less than a year, and this includes decisions such as pricing a one-time special order with no long-run implications, or perhaps adjusting your product mix and output volume in a competitive market. In the long run, we're talking about decisions that affect a year or longer, and this might include pricing a product in a major market where there's some leeway in setting your price. Now, what are some differences in the short run versus the long run? As you've probably learned earlier, costs that are often irrelevant for short run policy decisions, like fixed costs because they can't be changed in the short run, can become relevant in the long run because those costs can be altered in the long run. So you're constrained in the short run by what you've already spent, but in the long run, some of those fixed costs could be replaced and consequently then become relevant to the decision. Profit margins in the long run are set to earn a reasonable return on investment. Prices are decreased when demand is weak or increased when demand is strong. Can you think of an example of something that has increased recently in price because everyone wants it? And I can give you one example. Try finding a webcam right now for a decent price. Markets and pricing. There are competitive markets, less competitive markets, and then non-competitive markets. In a competitive market, you use the market-based approach, you're effectively a price taker. You have no effect really on the price in the market because everyone else is competing very vigorously in that same market. In a less competitive market, you can use either the market-based price or a cost-based approach. And then if you have some control over the market, if it's a non-competitive market, then you should use a cost-based approach. How does a cost-based approach work? Well, here, your selling price is computed based on the product's cost plus a markup. And the costs that you include in the base cost can be variable, or variable plus some fixed costs. In fact, some companies include only production costs in the cost base, while others might include production costs, selling costs, administrative costs, and so on. And it really does depend on what product you're talking about and how the company is determining which cost that they plan to use. Time and material pricing. In service organizations, cost-based pricing is determined by calculating a labor rate and a materials loading charge. Now, the labor rate includes your direct labor salaries plus benefits. It can often include things like selling and admin costs and related overhead costs and a desired profit amount. So for example, I needed to get a sprinkler head changed, and the person who came to my door to do the work actually was billing me out at $100 per hour. Now, I know that they weren't being paid $100 an hour because they were complaining about how much they get paid. And if they were complaining about it, I'm hoping they weren't getting paid $100 an hour and being unhappy with that. But anyway, the point here is that the labor rate typically is including a lot of the other costs and absorbing into that labor rate those other costs. The materials loading charge includes all costs associated with purchasing, receiving, handling, and storing materials, and a desired profit percentage. Now let's look at market-based pricing. Here you start with a target price, and this is the estimated price for the product or service that you plan to sell, and you get it by looking at what you think potential customers would be willing to pay for competing products or services, and this is based on the customer's perceived value for the product or service that you're selling. Obviously, the internet makes it a lot easier now to look up market prices for items, but in the past, that was actually a lot tougher to do. Companies will often use their competitor's price to establish their own market prices. Target costing is something else we're going to look at later in this course, but this is where you estimate the long-run cost per unit that, when sold at the target price, will allow the company to remain competitive and achieve its target margin percentage. So the idea here is you know what your selling price is, and you work backwards to say, if I want to earn X dollars, I have to have my cost at X, and now you look at value engineering to determine what cost that is and how you can arrive at that cost. We'll talk a lot more about this in a later video. Comparing cost-based versus market-based pricing approaches. A major drawback of cost-based pricing is that it ignores customer demand. So when you're setting a cost-based price, your sales volumes can inappropriately influence the price. Think of it this way: if you're trying to recover a fixed cost based on the numbers you expect to sell. Let's say you plan to sell 100 units, and your fixed cost was then divided by that 100 units. If your demand dropped to 50, now you're going to have twice as much fixed cost on a per unit basis, and this now puts even more cost on the product. If you remember elasticity from your economics course, you'll know that if the cost goes up and our price then goes up, then our demand is going to go down. And if our demand is going to go down, well, if we're allocating fixed costs based on demand, now our fixed costs per unit go back up. And this is going to lead to an even higher price, which leads to an even lower demand. So this is called a death spiral, because the idea is, as your demand is going down, your costs are going up, and then your price goes higher, and as your price goes higher, the demand gets even lower, and basically you're dead in the water. Now, the major benefit of using a cost-based approach is it's easy. Prices are calculated from readily available cost data. Using market-based prices to estimate revenues, managers can make better decisions about the sales volumes or whether to sell goods or services. The disadvantage of this method is that estimating market demand and prices is often quite difficult to do. Understanding the market environment. Understanding customers and competitors is important because, first of all, competition from lower-cost producers has meant that prices cannot be increased. Products are on the market for shorter periods of time, leaving less time and opportunity to recover from pricing mistakes. If you price something too low, believe me, there are forums that will post that everywhere, and your demand will go up, and by the time you even realize it, you're out of inventory. Customers have become more knowledgeable, and they're demanding quality products at reasonable prices. And the internet, and obviously global competition, have forced an increasingly large number of organizations to use market-based pricing. What are some strategies you can use when trying to establish your price? The first thing is called peak load pricing, and this is the practice of charging a higher price for the same product or service when the demand for it approaches the physical limit of the capacity to produce that product or service, or basically if you just want to charge more when things are really busy. An example of this would be Uber's surge pricing. At a very busy time of day, they will charge more. At less busy times of day, they will charge less. You see this with electricity in certain parts of the world as well. When the grid is really busy, they will charge more per kilowatt hour. So what some people will do, in fact, is they will have batteries for their homes that they charge when the cost of power is less, and then they use that power instead of pulling it off the grid. Price skimming. This occurs when a higher price is charged for a product or service when it's first introduced. So think about when a new iPhone hits the market. That's when it's going to be the most expensive. And the reason it's the most expensive is because Apple knows they can charge the highest price at that time because customers are willing to pay that price at that time for the latest technology. The opposite of this would be penetration pricing, and this is the practice of setting low prices when new products are introduced to increase market share. Price gouging is the practice of charging a price that's typically viewed by consumers as too high. And we've seen a lot of this with hand sanitizer being driven up in price because just there was none of it available, so people were charging whatever they wanted for it. Finally, transfer pricing. Prices are charged for transactions that take place within an organization, and there's a lot of strategy and discussion that we need to have about this, so we are going to look at this in a later video. Some other important considerations in pricing decisions. First of all, price discrimination. This is the practice of charging different customers different prices for the same product or service. Now this sounds super sketchy, but honestly, if I go to the aquarium with my kids, I pay more than they do. My kids are charged less than me, not because they're getting a lesser experience, but because the aquarium has decided strategically that it makes sense to charge kids a little less than adults. Price discrimination is illegal if the intent is to lessen or prevent competition for customers. Collusive pricing. This occurs when companies in an industry conspire in their pricing and production decisions to achieve a price above the competitive price and so restrain trade. Predatory pricing. This is where you deliberately lower prices below cost in an effort to drive competitors out of the market and restrict supply, and then raising prices later on. And finally, dumping. Dumping occurs when a foreign-based company sells products in an international market at prices that are below the market value in the country where the product is produced. Finally, government regulations and pricing. In Canada, illegal pricing practices are regulated under the Competition Act. Price fixing is an arrangement between competitors to sell a common product at the same price. Price maintenance occurs if a business uses its influence to encourage an increase or discourage a decrease in the price of a product in Canada. Thanks for watching.